The merciless sun of Burkina Faso hung like a blazing medallion in the cloudless sky, its rays transforming the bustling streets of Ouagadougou into shimmering rivers of heat. The air itself seemed to pulse with intensity, carrying the mingled scents of dust, motor oil, and the persistent hope that somehow, somewhere, life would get better. At the chaotic intersection of Avenue Kwame Nkrumah and Rue de la Révolution, where the symphony of car horns never ceased and the dance of traffic never paused, stood a humble workshop that most people passed without a second glance. It was little more than a corrugated iron shelter, its walls weathered by countless seasons, its floor stained with decades of automotive prayers answered and problems solved. This was Thomas Ouedraogo's kingdom, a realm measured not in luxury or grandeur, but in the satisfaction of engines that purr to life under his skilled hands and the gratitude of customers who depend on his honest work to keep their livelihoods moving. Thomas himself was a study in quiet dignity. At 32, his hands bore the permanent testimony of his trade. Nails outlined in black, palms calloused from years of gripping wrenches and wrestling with stubborn machinery. His clothes, though clean each morning, inevitably surrendered to the demands of his work by noon. Yet there was something in his posture, in the careful way he explained problems to worried customers, that spoke of an education that went far beyond the technical skills he'd acquired on these dusty streets. Those who had known Thomas in his youth would hardly recognize the circumstances that now defined his days, though they would instantly recognize the character that had always set him apart. In the village of Tenkadogo, 50 kilometers southeast of the capital, Thomas had once been the brightest star in a constellation of promising young minds. Teachers spoke his name with the reverence usually reserved for discussing rare gifts, and classmates sought his help with the confidence of those who knew they were learning from someone truly exceptional. "Thomas will be an engineer," his mathematics teacher, Monsieur Cafando, had declared with unwavering certainty during parent meetings. "Mark my words, this boy will build bridges that last centuries and design buildings that touch the sky. Our country needs minds like his." But life, as Thomas had learned with brutal clarity, rarely consults our plans when writing its own story. The fire came on a Tuesday night in March, when Thomas was 16 and the Harmattan wind still carried the last whispers of the dry season. He had been studying for his baccalaureate examinations, his textbooks spread across the small wooden table that served as both dining surface and desk in their modest family home. The kerosene lamp flickered as he worked through calculus problems, each solution bringing him one step closer to the engineering program at the University of Ouagadougou. His parents, Bourema and Fatou Ouedraogo, had saved every franc they could spare for his education. His father, a subsistence farmer who coaxed millet and sorghum from reluctant soil, would often work neighboring fields for extra income. His mother took in washing and sold small goods at the local market, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency as she counted out change for customers who trusted her honesty as much as her prices. "Education is the only inheritance we can give you that no one can ever take away," her mother would say, watching him study by lamplight. "Learn everything you can, my son. Learn for yourself, for us, and for all the children who will follow." The fire started in the kitchen, sparked by an overturned lamp that caught the dried thatch of the roof. By the time Thomas smelled smoke and rushed from his room, the flames had already claimed half the house. He found his parents in their bedroom, overcome by smoke, their bodies protecting his 7-year-old sister Aminata, who lay unconscious but breathing beneath them. The village rallied with fierce solidarity that defines rural communities facing crisis. Neighbors formed bucket chains, elders organized shelter, and the imam led prayers that rose like smoke into the star-filled sky. But no amount of community spirit could bring back Bourema and Fatou Ouedraogo, whose dreams of their children's future had died with them in the flames. In the weeks that followed, relatives debated Thomas's fate with the practical concern of people for whom survival always trumps sentiment. Most agreed that Aminata should be raised by their aunt in Bobo Dioulasso, while Thomas should continue his education. His exceptional grades had already attracted attention from scholarship committees. But Thomas made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Standing at his parents' graves on a morning when the air still smelled of ash and loss, he made a promise that only the red earth could hear. "I will not abandon my sister. I will not let her grow up wondering why her brother chose books over family. Aminata and I will face this world together." The scholarship committees pleaded. Teachers argued. Even the village chief, a man whose word typically ended all discussions, tried to convince Thomas to reconsider. But his decision was absolute, rooted in an understanding of responsibility that went far deeper than academic achievement. "Knowledge is important," Thomas told Monsieur Cafando during their final conversation, "but love is more important. My parents died protecting my sister. How can I honor their memory by abandoning her now?" Old Sawadogo found them 3 months later, 2 children sitting by the roadside with everything they owned wrapped in a single cloth bundle. Thomas was holding Aminata's hand while she cried, both of them watching the bus that would have taken him to university disappear in a cloud of red dust. Sawadogo was a mechanic whose reputation extended far beyond his small workshop on the outskirts of Tenkadogo. His hands could diagnose problems that left younger mechanics baffled, and his honesty was legendary in a trade often plagued by unnecessary repairs and inflated prices. He was also a man who understood that sometimes the most important education happens far from any classroom. "Young man," he said, approaching Thomas with the measured gait of someone who had learned to read people as expertly as he read engine problems, "I hear you're the boy who chose family over university." Thomas looked up warily. He had grown tired of pity, exhausted by well-meaning adults who wanted to discuss his sacrifice as if it were some noble abstraction rather than the simple reality of loving his sister more than his own ambitions. "I chose what was right," Thomas replied simply. Sawadogo nodded slowly. "And now? What will you do now?" "I'll find work. I'll take care of my sister. We'll survive." "Survival is not enough," the old mechanic said, settling onto the ground beside them. "A mind like yours needs purpose. Hands like yours need skills. And a heart like yours needs to know it can still build something meaningful." Over the following weeks, Sawadogo became a daily presence in their lives. He taught Thomas to see beyond the surface of mechanical problems, to understand that every engine was a puzzle waiting to be solved, every repair a chance to restore something broken to wholeness. Under the patient guidance of this master craftsman, Thomas discovered that his analytical mind, the same mind that had excelled at calculus and physics, could find profound satisfaction in the practical art of mechanical repair. "Engineering and mechanics are cousins," Sawadogo explained, as Thomas mastered the intricacies of carburetor adjustment. "Both require you to understand how systems work together. Both demand precision, patience, and the ability to see solutions where others see only problems. The only difference is that engineers design on paper, while mechanics design with their hands." Aminata thrived under this new arrangement. The old mechanic's workshop became her playground, and the various customers who brought their vehicles for repair became an extended family who watched over her with protective affection. She learned to distinguish the sounds of different engines, to recognize when a problem was serious or merely annoying, and to treat every mechanical challenge as an interesting puzzle rather than an insurmountable obstacle. "Your brother," Sawadogo told her one afternoon, as Thomas successfully completed a particularly difficult transmission repair, has the rarest gift of all. He can take things that are broken and make them better than they were before. For 3 years, this arrangement provided stability, purpose, and a kind of happiness that Thomas had not expected to find after losing his parents. But as Aminata grew from child to young adolescent, and Thomas's skills developed from competent to exceptional, he began to feel the pull of broader horizons. "Master," he said to Sawadogo one evening as they cleaned their tools, "I think it's time for us to go to Ouagadougou. Aminata needs better schools than this village can provide, and I need to earn enough money to give her the opportunities our parents would have wanted." The old mechanic had been expecting this conversation for months. He saw how Thomas's eyes followed every bus heading toward the capital, witnessed his former students' growing confidence in tackling mechanical challenges that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. "You're ready," Sawadogo agreed. "But remember, success in the city requires different skills than success in the village. In Ouagadougou, you'll be competing with mechanics who learned their trade in technical schools, working alongside men who judge worth by certificates rather than character. Stay true to what I've taught you: honesty, quality, and respect for every customer, no matter how small their problem or limited their budget." Ouagadougou welcomed Thomas and Aminata with all the indifferent brutality of a city that had seen countless rural migrants arrive with dreams larger than their resources. They found lodging in Sessine, a sprawling neighborhood where hope and desperation lived side by side in structures that seemed to multiply overnight, each family carving out whatever space they could claim in the urban landscape. Their single room was barely large enough for 2 sleeping mats and Thomas's tool collection, but it represented possibility in a way their village never could. Here, Aminata could attend a secondary school with actual science laboratories and a library containing more books than existed in all of Tenkodogo. Here, Thomas could access the kinds of automotive challenges that would develop his skills beyond anything rural mechanics ever encountered. Finding work, however, proved more difficult than either had anticipated. The capital's established mechanics viewed newcomers with suspicion, especially those who arrived without formal certificates or connections to influential families. Shop owners were reluctant to trust expensive equipment to someone whose only credentials were calloused hands and references from a village teacher and an old mechanic whose name meant nothing in urban circles. For weeks, Thomas walked from garage to garage, his tool bag growing heavier with each rejection. Some proprietors dismissed him before he could even explain his qualifications. Others subjected him to tests designed more to humiliate than evaluate, asking him to diagnose problems on vehicles he had never seen, while experienced mechanics watched with amusement. It was during one of these discouraging rounds that Thomas encountered the intersection that would define the next phase of his life. Avenue Kwame Nkrumah met Rue de la Révolution at a point where traffic congestion created a daily theater of mechanical failures. Cars overheated in the sun, motorcycles broke down in the middle of traffic, and frustrated drivers found themselves stranded with no immediate access to professional help. Thomas noticed the pattern during his 3rd week of job hunting. Every day, vehicles limped to this corner, their owners desperate for immediate assistance but unwilling to abandon their transportation to seek help at distant garages. It was a market waiting for someone with the courage to claim it. Using his last savings, Thomas purchased a small collection of basic tools and a wooden stool that would serve as both workbench and chair. He positioned himself at the corner with a simple cardboard sign: "Honest repairs, fair prices, all work guaranteed." His first customer was a taxi driver whose radiator had chosen that exact moment to surrender to years of neglect. The man was frantic, His taxi was his only source of income, and every minute off the road meant money lost and passengers disappointed. "Can you really fix this here?" the driver asked skeptically, gesturing at Thomas's modest setup. "I can try," Thomas replied. "If I can't solve the problem, you pay nothing. If I can, you pay what you think the work is worth." It took Thomas 40 minutes to diagnose a simple leak, fashion a temporary seal, and refill the cooling system with water purchased from a nearby vendor. The taxi roared back to life, its owner's relief evident in his broad smile and generous payment. Word spread through the taxi driver's network with the speed that news travels in communities where everyone's survival depends on reliable transportation. Within days, Thomas found himself with a steady stream of customers who appreciated both his technical competence and his transparent pricing. Unlike established garages that quoted mysterious costs for unnamed parts, Thomas explained exactly what he was doing and why, allowing customers to understand and approve each step of the repair process. Among Thomas's most treasured memories from his school days in Tenkodogo was his friendship with Ibrahim Traoré, a boy whose quiet intelligence and natural leadership had complemented Thomas's academic brilliance perfectly. While Thomas excelled in mathematics and sciences, Ibrahim possessed an intuitive understanding of people and systems that made him a natural mediator and problem solver. They had been inseparable throughout their secondary school years, studying together, sharing meals, dreaming about the future they would build for their country. Ibrahim came from a military family, his father a respected officer who instilled in his son a deep sense of duty and patriotic responsibility. Their conversations often extended late into the night, two young minds exploring ideas about governance, development, and their roles in Burkina Faso's future. One day, Ibrahim had told Thomas during one of their evening walks through Tenkodogo's quiet streets, "I'm going to lead this country, not because I want power, but because I can't stand watching good people suffer while corrupt leaders get rich. And I'll build the roads and bridges you'll need," Thomas had replied with the confidence of youth. "Together, we'll make Burkina Faso a place where every child can dream as big as we do." Those conversations felt like another lifetime now, as Thomas crouched beside yet another broken motorcycle while the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on his back. Ibrahim had gone on to military academy, then to advanced training abroad, climbing through ranks and responsibilities that had carried him far from their shared village origins. Thomas often wondered if his old friend ever thought about their boyhood promises, or if the realities of military and political life had replaced those idealistic dreams with more practical ambitions. He had followed Ibrahim's career from a distance, noting his rapid promotion through various military positions, his appointment to increasingly significant roles in national security, and finally his emergence as a key figure in the political transformation that had brought him to the presidency. The newspapers that Thomas read during quiet moments at his roadside workshop painted Ibrahim as a reform-minded leader, committed to fighting corruption and improving conditions for ordinary citizens. "He kept his promise," Thomas would think to himself, feeling a mixture of pride and wistfulness. "He's actually doing what we talked about all those years ago." But Thomas never imagined that their paths would cross again, especially not under circumstances that would test every principle they had discussed as idealistic teenagers. The morning of their reunion began like any other in Thomas's carefully ordered routine. He arrived at his corner workshop before dawn, organizing tools and checking his supply of common replacement parts. The early hours were often his most productive. Cooler temperatures made physical work less exhausting, and the relative quiet allowed him to focus on complex diagnostic challenges. By mid-morning, he was deep into a particularly stubborn electrical problem in an aging Peugeot sedan, when he noticed unusual activity in the traffic patterns around his intersection. Vehicles were slowing, drivers craning their necks to see something beyond the normal range of urban curiosities. The steady flow of honking horns and revving engines gradually gave way to an expectant hush that suggested something significant was about to happen. Thomas was too absorbed in tracing a faulty wiring harness to pay much attention to external distractions. This was one of his most valuable professional traits, the ability to maintain focus on the task at hand regardless of surrounding chaos. Customers appreciated a mechanic who could work steadily through problems while taxi drivers argued and street vendors hawked their wares just meters away. The arrival of the presidential convoy created a disturbance that even Thomas's legendary concentration couldn't ignore. The sleek, black vehicles moved with the practiced precision of a security detail accustomed to navigating urban environments where every corner might conceal either opportunities or threats. Curious pedestrians gathered at what they judged to be respectful distances, their faces reflecting the mixture of excitement and apprehension that typically accompanies unexpected encounters with political authority. Thomas glanced up briefly, noted the official license plates and uniformed escorts, then returned his attention to the Peugeot's electrical system. Presidents and ministers traveled through Ouagadougou regularly, their movements creating temporary disruptions in traffic flow before normalcy resumed. He had work to finish and customers waiting. Whatever official business had brought this convoy to his intersection was undoubtedly more important than his automotive repairs, but it was also none of his concern. The sound of his name, spoken with a mixture of disbelief and recognition that transcended the normal distance between citizens and political figures, cut through his professional focus like lightning through storm clouds. The voice carried inflections that transported him instantly back to teenage conversations under baobab trees, to shared textbooks and collaborative problem-solving sessions, to dreams discussed with the absolute certainty that characterized youthful planning. It was a voice that had called his name across school courtyards, during village football matches, throughout countless evenings when two friends had reimagined their country's future. When Thomas looked up from the engine compartment and saw Ibrahim Traoré, President Ibrahim Traoré, standing just meters away, the years collapsed like a house of cards. The military uniform, the official entourage, the weight of presidential responsibility, none of it mattered in that instant. What mattered was the recognition in Ibrahim's eyes, the visible emotion that suggested this encounter was as unexpected and overwhelming for the president as it was for the roadside mechanic. "Ibrahim," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying its own freight of memory and surprise. The embrace that followed transcended every protocol that typically governs interactions between heads of state and ordinary citizens. It was the reunion of two men who had once shared dreams so ambitious that they seemed destined to reshape the world, who had promised each other loyalty that would survive any distance or circumstance, who had genuinely believed that their friendship was strong enough to overcome whatever obstacles life might present. The crowd's reaction was immediate and profound. Gasps, murmurs, and the rapid clicking of camera phones created a soundscape of astonishment as hundreds of witnesses tried to process what they were seeing. This was their president, the man whose speeches they heard on radio, whose policies affected their daily lives, whose decisions shaped their national destiny, embracing a street mechanic with the fervor of a brother welcoming home a long-lost sibling. What followed was perhaps the most unusual presidential visit in Burkina Faso's modern history. Ibrahim Traoré, a man whose schedule was typically measured in minutes and whose movements were choreographed with military precision, dismissed every protocol in favor of sitting on a wooden stool beside his childhood friend's workspace. The image that emerged from that afternoon, the president of Burkina Faso, sharing a bench with a grease-stained mechanic while curious crowds gathered and traffic slowed to witness this unprecedented scene, would become one of the most powerful symbols of Ibrahim's presidency. But for the two men at its center, the significance was far more personal than political. "Tell me everything," Ibrahim said, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who realized how much time had been lost, how many important conversations had been missed. "Tell me how you got here, what happened to your dreams, why fate brought us back together at this dusty corner instead of in some university laboratory or government ministry." Thomas's response was characteristically straightforward. He spoke without self-pity or resentment, explaining the fire that had claimed his parents, his decision to care for Aminata, the years of learning from old Sawadago, and the gradual journey that had brought him to this intersection where broken vehicles became whole again under his careful attention. "I don't regret the choices I made," Thomas said, watching his friend's face for any sign of pity or condescension. "Aminata is in school now, learning everything she wants to learn. I have work that matters to people who need it. We have enough food, adequate shelter, and each other. In many ways, I've been blessed." Ibrahim listened with the focused attention of someone accustomed to receiving complex information quickly and accurately. But this was different from receiving briefings on economic policy or military strategy. This was his closest friend explaining how life had redirected dreams through channels that no teenage planning session could have anticipated. "But you were supposed to be designing buildings," Ibrahim said softly. "You were supposed to be the engineer who solved our infrastructure problems, who built bridges that would last for generations." Thomas smiled, gesturing toward the tools arranged around his workspace. "I do solve problems. I do build things that last. They're just smaller problems and smaller things than what we imagined." The conversation that followed, conducted while curious onlookers maintained respectful distances, and security personnel tried to balance protection protocols with their president's clear intention to remain exactly where he was, covered decades of separate experiences and parallel growth. Ibrahim spoke about military training that had taught him discipline and strategic thinking, about political responsibilities that had introduced him to the complex realities of governance, about the weight of making decisions that affected millions of lives. Thomas shared stories about customers who had become friends, about mechanical challenges that had pushed his skills to their limits, about the satisfaction of solving problems with his hands and seeing immediate, tangible results from his work. Both men began to understand that while their paths had diverged dramatically, the values that had defined their friendship, honesty, loyalty, commitment to helping others, had remained constant in both their lives. When Aminata arrived that afternoon, running breathlessly from school to find her father in conversation with the president of Burkina Faso, the encounter took on additional layers of meaning. Ibrahim saw in this bright, confident young woman the future that Thomas had protected and nurtured through years of personal sacrifice. Thomas saw in Ibrahim's immediate warmth toward Aminata the same generous spirit that had characterized their boyhood friendship. "She's beautiful," Ibrahim said, watching Aminata's amazement at finding herself in such extraordinary circumstances. "She's going to be a doctor," Thomas said with quiet pride. "She says she wants to help people the way I fix engines, by understanding how all the parts work together and knowing what to do when something goes wrong." The promise that Ibrahim made that afternoon was not a politician's casual pledge or a gesture designed for public consumption. It was the commitment of a friend who had been given the opportunity to honor old loyalties and support someone whose character he knew intimately.
"This ends today," Ibrahim said firmly. "Your days of struggling to make ends meet, of watching your daughter's brilliant mind being limited by financial constraints, all of that ends today. You reminded me of who I am and why I wanted to lead this country. Now let me show you what leadership should look like." The transformation of Thomas's circumstances following Ibrahim's public recognition brought changes that extended far beyond improved financial security or enhanced social status. Within days, his simple roadside workshop had been replaced by a modern training facility, equipped with the latest diagnostic equipment and designed to accommodate dozens of aspiring mechanics. The cramped room he had shared with Aminata in Sison was exchanged for a comfortable house in one of Ouagadougou's better neighborhoods. Most importantly, Aminata's educational opportunities had expanded to include the finest schools in the country and eventually scholarships to international universities. But perhaps the most significant change was the way people looked at Thomas himself. No longer was he simply another roadside mechanic struggling to make ends meet. Now he was the president's friend, the man whose loyalty and character had been publicly celebrated, the symbol of what honest work and moral integrity could achieve even under the most challenging circumstances. This transformation brought opportunities that Thomas had never imagined. But it also attracted attention from people whose motives were far less noble than those of his regular customers or the government officials who had facilitated his new circumstances. The first approach came exactly 3 weeks after Ibrahim's public announcement of the training center and scholarships. Thomas was inspecting the new facility's equipment, familiarizing himself with diagnostic computers and hydraulic lifts that represented technology he had only read about in automotive magazines, when 2 well-dressed men arrived in a luxury sedan. They introduced themselves as business consultants, claiming to represent investors interested in expanding automotive services throughout West Africa. Their conversation was polite, professional, and filled with impressive statistics about regional market opportunities and projected returns on strategic investments. "We've been watching your success," the taller man explained, his French polished with the kind of accent that suggested expensive education and international experience. "Your rise from street mechanic to presidential confidant is exactly the kind of story that inspires investor confidence. We think you could be the face of a new kind of automotive enterprise, one that combines technical expertise with authentic local connections." Thomas listened politely, but something about their presentation felt wrong. The numbers they quoted were too precise for preliminary discussions, their knowledge of his personal circumstances too detailed for casual research, their interest in his relationship with Ibrahim too focused for legitimate business purposes. "What exactly would you need from me?" Thomas asked carefully. The shorter man leaned forward, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "Nothing complicated. Mostly, we'd want you to continue being yourself, the honest mechanic who earned the president's trust. Occasionally, we might ask you to arrange meetings or facilitate introductions. Your access to decision-makers would be invaluable for ensuring that our investments receive appropriate consideration." "Access to decision-makers," Thomas repeated slowly, his mechanic's instinct for diagnosing problems beginning to identify something seriously wrong with this conversation. "Particularly President Traoré," the first man clarified. "Your friendship with him is obviously unique and valuable. We're not asking you to betray any confidences or compromise any principles. We simply want to ensure that when opportunities arise for beneficial partnerships, we can present them through channels that guarantee serious consideration." Thomas stood up, his decision already made.
"Gentlemen, I appreciate your interest, but I'm not the right person for what you're describing. My friendship with the president is personal, not professional. It's not something I would use for business purposes." The men exchanged glances, their polished demeanor slipping slightly. "Perhaps you should take some time to consider," the taller man suggested. "These kinds of opportunities don't come along often, especially for someone with your background." "My background is exactly why I'm saying no. I know the difference between right and wrong, and what you're suggesting feels wrong." They left without argument, but not before the shorter man handed Thomas a business card. "In case you change your mind," he said, "the offer will remain open for a reasonable period." Thomas threw the card in the trash before they reached their car, but the encounter left him unsettled. Something about their approach suggested that his refusal was viewed as a temporary setback rather than a final decision. The second approach, 3 days later, dispensed with subtlety entirely. This time, the visitors were clearly not legitimate businessmen. They drove a different luxury vehicle, wore expensive clothes that couldn't disguise their underlying menace, and spoke with the directness of people accustomed to having their requests accepted without argument. "We know who you are," the first man said without preamble, settling into Thomas's office without invitation. "More importantly, we know who your friend is and how much he trusts you." "What do you want?" Thomas asked, remaining standing, his hand resting on the telephone that could summon security guards within seconds. The second man placed a thick envelope on Thomas's desk. 5 million CFA, more money than you've ever seen at one time. There's a simple job that goes with it." "What kind of job?" "The next time President Traoré visits you, and we know he visits regularly now, you'll serve him something to drink, something we provide, something that will make him sick for a while, maybe require some hospitalization, possibly create some confusion about his ability to continue in office." Thomas stared at them, his mind racing through the implications of what they were suggesting. "You want me to poison the president?" "We want you to help create opportunities for positive change," the first man corrected smoothly. "President Traoré has made some powerful enemies with his anti-corruption campaigns and his insistence on prosecuting officials who have enriched themselves at the public expense. There are people who believe Burkina Faso would benefit from different leadership, people who are prepared to reward those who help facilitate necessary transitions." "And if I refuse?" The second man's smile was cold and predatory. "Why would you refuse? You're a street mechanic who got lucky because of childhood friendship. This is your chance to become truly wealthy, to secure your daughter's future in ways that even presidential scholarships can't guarantee. Houses in Paris, Swiss bank accounts, connections to people who control real power, all of this can be yours for one simple act of service." Thomas felt a clarity settle over him that was similar to the focus he achieved when diagnosing complex mechanical problems. All the variables became visible, all the relationships between cause and effect became transparent, and the correct course of action became undeniable. "I need to think about this," he said carefully. "Of course, but don't take too much time. Opportunities like this have expiration dates, and hesitation can be expensive." After they left, Thomas sat alone in his office, staring at the envelope of money and thinking about loyalty, friendship, and the price of integrity. He thought about Ibrahim's trust, about the friendship that had survived decades of separation, and about the responsibility that came with being someone the president of Burkina Faso considered a brother. Most of all, he thought about his parents, whose sacrifice had been motivated by their determination to raise children who would choose right over wrong regardless of the personal cost. That evening, Thomas called Ibrahim's personal number, a privilege that still amazed him every time he used it. Within an hour, he was sitting in the presidential study, the envelope of money, and his complete account of both encounters, spread before his oldest friend. Ibrahim listened without interruption, his expression growing darker as Thomas described the escalating pressure and increasingly explicit threats. When Thomas finished his account, the room fell into a silence that stretched until both men could hear the distant sounds of evening traffic beyond the palace walls. "They chose well," Ibrahim said finally. "If there's anyone in this country I would trust completely, it's you. If there's anyone whose access to me would seem natural and unsuspicious, it's you. If there's anyone who could actually succeed in such a plan, it's you." "But they chose wrong," Thomas replied quietly. "They assumed that because I'm poor, I'm also corruptible. They thought because I work with my hands, I don't think with my heart. They believed because I never went to university, I never learned right from wrong." Ibrahim leaned back in his chair, studying his friend's face. What they didn't understand is that integrity isn't something you acquire through formal education or lose through economic hardship. It's something you choose every day, regardless of circumstances. The investigation that followed moved with the efficiency of a security apparatus that had been preparing for exactly this kind of threat. Within hours, both sets of visitors had been identified, their communications monitored, their connections to larger networks of political opposition mapped and analyzed. The arrests came at dawn, synchronized operations that swept up not just the direct conspirators, but the entire network of foreign-funded operatives who had been working to destabilize Ibrahim's government. The interrogations revealed a conspiracy far more extensive than a simple assassination plot, a comprehensive plan to create political chaos that would justify international intervention and the installation of a more compliant government. "You didn't just save my life," Ibrahim told Thomas as they reviewed the security reports together. "You uncovered a threat to our entire democratic system, to everything we've been trying to build since independence." But for Thomas, the significance of his choice ran deeper than its political implications. Standing in that presidential study, looking at evidence of how close his country had come to falling into the hands of those who viewed its people as obstacles to their ambitions, he understood that his decision had been more than friendship or loyalty. "When those men looked at me," Thomas said slowly, "they saw someone they thought they could buy. They saw poverty and assumed it meant weakness. They saw honest work and mistook it for ignorance. They never understood that the things they were offering, money, luxury, power, weren't worth the price they were asking." Ibrahim clasped his friend's shoulder. "They understood everything about corruption and nothing about character. That's why they failed, and that's why we'll succeed." The public revelation of the conspiracy and Thomas's role in exposing it transformed him once again, this time from presidential friend to national hero. Newspapers across Burkina Faso carried the story of the mechanic who chose loyalty over riches, who valued friendship more than money, who understood that true wealth comes from knowing you can sleep peacefully with your decisions. "You reminded us," wrote one letter from a village teacher in Gorma province, "that being poor doesn't mean being worthless, and that choosing right over wrong is always possible, no matter how difficult the circumstances."
A group of mechanics from Bobo Dioulasso pooled their resources to send a delegation to Ouagadougou, bringing a handmade toolset engraved with the words, "To Thomas Ouedraogo, who showed us that our work has dignity and our choices have power." Most moving of all was a letter from students at the University of Ouagadougou, the institution where Thomas had once dreamed of studying engineering. "You taught us," they wrote, "that there are many ways to build a better country. Some people build with steel and concrete, others build with laws and policies. You build with loyalty and courage, and your construction will last longer than any bridge or building." The training center that bore Thomas's name became more than just a technical school. It evolved into a symbol of second chances and alternative paths to success. Young people who had been forced to abandon formal education found opportunities to develop marketable skills. Adults who had struggled with unemployment discovered new careers in automotive repair and maintenance. Most importantly, everyone who passed through the program learned not just technical skills, but the values that Thomas embodied: honesty in business dealings, pride in quality work, and loyalty to principles that transcended personal advantage. As months passed, the impact of Thomas's story began to resonate far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. International media picked up the narrative of the mechanic who refused millions to betray his friend, the president who remembered his roots, and the friendship that had survived decades of separation to reshape a nation's understanding of leadership and loyalty. Diplomatic delegations began requesting meetings with Thomas, not as a curiosity or photo opportunity, but as someone whose perspective on governance and civic responsibility offered insights that traditional political analysis couldn't provide. Universities invited him to speak about ethics and decision-making. Business schools wanted him to address their students about integrity in professional relationships. "They want to study us like specimens," Thomas told Ibrahim during one of their regular evening conversations, as if friendship and honesty were some rare disease that needed to be isolated and examined. Ibrahim laughed, pouring tea for both of them in the comfortable sitting room of Thomas's new home. "Maybe that's exactly what the world needs, an epidemic of loyalty and integrity spreading from one friendship to another." These conversations had become a cherished routine, a weekly opportunity for two men whose responsibilities had grown exponentially to remember the boys they had once been and the dreams that had shaped their characters. They talked about policy and politics, but also about family and friendship, about the weight of expectations and the challenge of remaining true to fundamental principles when circumstances demanded compromise. "Sometimes I wonder," Ibrahim mused during one such evening, "if we achieved more than we ever imagined, or less than we promised ourselves." Thomas considered this carefully, his mechanic's precision extending to philosophical questions as well as technical problems. "We promised to change Burkina Faso together. You've changed it through leadership and policy. I've changed it through example and education. Maybe the promise was kept, just not in the way we expected." The truth of this observation was becoming increasingly evident in the programs and policies that emerged from Ibrahim's presidency. The emphasis on technical education had expanded far beyond automotive repair to include agriculture, construction, and manufacturing. Scholarship programs now prioritized character references alongside academic achievement. Government contracts began including integrity clauses that empowered officials to terminate agreements with vendors who attempted to offer bribes or cut corners on quality. The Thomas Standard, as some cabinet ministers privately called these new requirements, was transforming how business was conducted throughout the government. Contractors who had grown accustomed to inflated invoices and substandard materials found themselves competing in an environment where honesty and quality work were actually rewarded rather than penalized.
While Thomas navigated his unexpected role as a national symbol, his daughter Aminata was completing her secondary education with the kind of academic excellence that would have made her grandfather proud. Her scholarship to the International School of Ouagadougou had provided access to advanced coursework and international perspectives that prepared her for university-level study anywhere in the world. But it was her response to her father's fame that most impressed those who knew her well. Rather than being overwhelmed by sudden wealth and attention, Aminata remained focused on her studies and her long-term goal of becoming a physician. She volunteered at local clinics, organized study groups for classmates who struggled with difficult subjects, and maintained the same humble dignity that had always characterized her father. I want people to remember Aminata Ouedraogo for what she accomplished, not for what her father did or who her father knows. Her medical school applications, submitted during her final year of secondary school, reflected this determination to be judged on her own merits. While she could have leveraged her father's connection to Ibrahim for admission to any program, she instead chose to apply through regular channels, submitting essays that focused on her volunteer work and her vision for improving healthcare in rural communities. The acceptance letter from the University of Dakar's medical school arrived on the same day that Thomas received news of another honor, an invitation to address the African Union Summit on the role of civil society in promoting good governance. Both pieces of mail sat unopened on the kitchen table as father and daughter shared their evening meal, each aware that these envelopes contained confirmation of new responsibilities and opportunities. "Are you nervous?" Thomas asked as Aminata finally opened her letter. "About medical school? No," she replied, scanning the acceptance documents. "About living up to the example you've set? Absolutely."
Thomas reached across the table and took her hand. "The only example I've tried to set is to choose right over wrong, no matter what it costs. If you remember that, everything else will follow." The farewell dinner that Esther organized before Aminata's departure for Dakar brought together the extended family of friends, neighbors, and mentors who had supported their journey from roadside mechanics to national recognition. Ibrahim and his wife attended, sitting at the same table with former customers from Thomas's street corner workshop, teachers from Aminata's schools, and mechanics from the training center. "This is what success looks like," Ibrahim told the gathering during his impromptu remarks. "Not the certificates or awards or newspaper articles, but this room full of people who genuinely care about each other's well-being and who celebrate each other's achievements without jealousy or competition." 5 years after their reunion at the dusty intersection, Thomas and Ibrahim had settled into a friendship that balanced public responsibilities with private support. Thomas's training center had expanded into a network of technical schools across West Africa. Ibrahim's presidency had survived multiple challenges while maintaining the reformist agenda that had defined his early years in office. The international recognition that both men received, Ibrahim as a model of incorruptible leadership, Thomas as an example of principled citizenship, never overshadowed their fundamental commitment to the people and communities that had shaped their characters. They remained accessible to ordinary citizens, responsive to local concerns, and grounded in the values that had sustained them through decades of separation and recent years of intense scrutiny. Thomas's daily routine still included hands-on work in the training center's workshop, teaching students not just technical skills, but the problem-solving approaches that had served him throughout his career. His favorite students were those who reminded him of himself at their age, intelligent young people whose formal education had been interrupted by circumstances beyond their control, but whose determination to build better lives remained unshaken. "Every engine is different," he would tell them, but the principles of diagnosis and repair are universal. Listen carefully, observe closely, think systematically, and never be afraid to admit when you don't know something. The moment you stop learning is the moment you stop being useful. Ibrahim's speeches increasingly reflected conversations with Thomas about the relationship between leadership and service, about the importance of staying connected to the daily realities of citizens' lives, about the danger of political power becoming separated from moral responsibility. A president who doesn't know the price of rice or the cost of school fees is a president who has forgotten why leadership exists. Power should make us more aware of people's struggles, not less aware of them. The friendship that had survived teenage dreams, adult separation, and unexpected reunion had evolved into something that transcended personal affection. It had become a model for how relationships of trust and mutual respect could transform not just individual lives, but entire societies. Among Thomas's most treasured possessions was a collection of letters from people whose lives had been touched by his story. These came from across Africa and beyond, from mechanics in Lagos who had organized their own training programs, from students in Cairo who had chosen integrity over easier paths to success, from teachers in rural villages who used Thomas's example to encourage children facing difficult circumstances. One letter, from a young woman in Ivory Coast, captured the broader impact of his choice. My uncle wanted me to marry an older man who promised to pay my school fees in exchange. When I read about you choosing your principles over money, I found the courage to refuse. I'm working part-time and studying part-time now, and it's harder than the easy path would have been, but I sleep peacefully, knowing I made the right choice. Another, from a group of automotive students in Ghana, expressed gratitude for demonstrating that technical work had dignity and importance. Before we heard your story, we felt ashamed of learning to fix cars instead of going to university. Now we understand that every kind of honest work matters, and that character is more important than credentials. Thomas responded personally to every letter he received, often working late into the evening to ensure that people who had taken the time to write received thoughtful responses. These correspondences became another form of teaching, another way of sharing the lessons he had learned through his own journey from village student to presidential confidant. Each letter reminds me, Thomas told Esther one evening as he sealed envelopes addressed to correspondents across 3 continents, that none of us lives only for ourselves. Every choice we make, every example we set, ripples outward in ways we might never fully understand. As Ibrahim's presidency matured and Thomas's reputation as an educator and moral exemplar grew, both men faced the inevitable challenges that accompany sustained public attention. Critics emerged who questioned whether their friendship represented genuine virtue or merely successful public relations. Opposition politicians attempted to portray Thomas as a naive tool, being manipulated by a calculating president. International commentators debated whether their story was too good to be true, a carefully crafted narrative designed to enhance Ibrahim's image. These criticisms stung, but they also strengthened both men's resolve to live up to the expectations their story had created. They understood that public figures must accept scrutiny as part of their responsibilities, and that the best response to cynicism was continued demonstration of the principles they claimed to represent. "Let them question our motives," Ibrahim told Thomas during a particularly difficult period when opposition newspapers were running daily stories questioning their relationship. "Our actions will speak louder than their doubts." Thomas's response was characteristically practical. People who have never experienced true friendship find it hard to believe it exists. People who have never chosen principles over profit assume everyone else is as compromised as they are. We can't change their minds, but we can continue proving them wrong. The ultimate validation of their friendship came not from media coverage or political analysis, but from the tangible improvements in the lives of people who had been touched by their example. The technical education programs had created thousands of jobs and transformed entire communities. The emphasis on integrity in government contracting had reduced corruption and improved public infrastructure. The scholarship programs had opened opportunities for young people who might otherwise have been trapped by poverty. Most importantly, the culture of civic responsibility that their story had helped inspire was creating a new generation of leaders who understood that public service was exactly that, service to the public, rather than opportunities for personal enrichment. 10 years after their reunion at the dusty intersection, Thomas and Ibrahim stood together at the inauguration of the Central African Technical Education Institute, a regional training center that would serve students from across the continent. Aminata, now Dr. Aminata Ouedraogo, was completing her residency in pediatric medicine and planning her return to Burkina Faso to establish rural health clinics. The ceremony brought together hundreds of people whose lives had been changed by programs inspired by their friendship: mechanics and engineers, teachers and students, government officials and private citizens who had found in their story proof that integrity and loyalty could still triumph over corruption and self-interest. "We dreamed of changing our country," Thomas reflected as they watched graduates receive their certificates. "We never imagined we might change how people think about friendship, about leadership, about the relationship between power and responsibility." Ibrahim nodded, his own thoughts running along similar lines. The greatest leaders in history weren't remembered for their authority, but for their character. The most enduring friendships aren't based on convenience or benefit, but on shared values and mutual respect. As the sun set over Ouagadougou, painting the sky in the golden hues that had witnessed their childhood dreams and adult achievements, both men understood that their story was far from finished. The principles they had demonstrated, loyalty, integrity, service to others, would continue inspiring people they would never meet, in places they would never visit, facing challenges they could never imagine. The intersection where they had been reunited was now marked by a small monument, not to their friendship specifically, but to the idea that everyone has the power to choose right over wrong, that circumstances never eliminate moral responsibility, that true success is measured not by what we accumulate, but by what we contribute. Engraved in simple script on the monument's base were words that captured the essence of their shared journey. At this corner, two friends remembered that character is not determined by position or wealth, but by the choices we make when no one is watching, and the principles we maintain when compromise would be easier. Children on their way to school passed the monument each morning, many stopping to read the inscription and ask their parents about the story it commemorated. In this way, the lessons of loyalty and integrity were passed to a new generation, ensuring that the values Thomas and Ibrahim had demonstrated would outlive both men and continue shaping their country's future. Their friendship had begun with shared dreams of changing Burkina Faso. It had survived decades of separation and the pressures of unexpected fame. Most importantly, it had proven that the bonds formed by common values and mutual respect could not only endure, but could transform the world around them in ways that individual achievement never could. As they walked home together that evening, past the training centers and schools that bore their names, through neighborhoods where their story was told and retold as an example of what was possible when good people chose to remain good, Thomas and Ibrahim understood that they had achieved something far greater than their teenage ambitions had encompassed. They had not just changed their country, they had demonstrated that change was possible, that integrity was powerful, and that friendship,
when grounded in shared principles and mutual respect, could indeed transform the world. This story reminds us that true friendship transcends circumstances, that integrity is more valuable than wealth, and that the choices we make in moments of testing define not only our own character, but the kind of world we leave for those who come after us. In a time when cynicism often overshadows hope, when power frequently corrupts those who wield it, and when personal gain too often trumps public good, the friendship between Thomas and Ibrahim stands as proof that better choices are always possible, and that making those choices can inspire others to do the same. The dusty intersection where they were reunited may just be one corner in one city in one country, but the principles they demonstrated there, loyalty over profit, integrity over advantage, service over self-interest, are universal values that can transform any community, any nation, any friendship fortunate enough to embrace them.